The moment your dog stops running to the door when you come home, something has already changed. Michael Carter stood there with his keys still in his hand, the soft click of the front door echoing a little louder than usual in the quiet hallway, and for the first time in years, there was no sound of paws scrambling across the hardwood floor, no excited tail thumping against the wall, no golden blur racing toward him like he was the center of the universe, just silence, heavy and unfamiliar, and then, a few seconds later, Buddy appeared slowly from the living room, not running, not jumping. Just walking, his head slightly lowered, his eyes flicking up for a brief second before looking away again. And if you didn't know what to look for, you might think nothing of it. You might even tell yourself he's just tired, or distracted, or growing out of that puppy energy. But something in that moment felt off in a way Michael couldn't explain, because this was the same dog who used to wait by the door every single day. The same dog who would sit there for minutes, sometimes longer, years. Perked, body tense with anticipation, just to be the first thing Michael saw when he got home. And now, that moment was gone, replaced by something quieter, something colder. And the truth is, moments like this don't happen all at once. They don't come with a warning sign or a dramatic shift. They build slowly, almost invisibly, through small things you do every single day without realizing it. The quick, no, said a little too sharply when you're stressed, the leash tugged just a bit harder because you're in a hurry, the times you say their name not with warmth, but with frustration, the moments you reach for your phone instead of their eyes. None of these feel like a big deal on their own. None of them feel like something that could change the way your dog sees you. But to your dog, those moments don't disappear, they stack. They settle somewhere deep in their mind, shaping how safe they feel, how connected they feel, how much they trust that being close to you is a good thing. And here's what most people never realize. Your dog doesn't hold grudges the way humans do. They don't sit there thinking about revenge or resentment, but they do remember how you make them feel. And when certain feelings repeat often enough, something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the way they look at you, in the way they respond to you, in the way they choose whether or not to come close. And by the time you notice it, by the time you feel that small distance that wasn't there before, it's already been building for a long time. And the hardest part is, you might be doing it right now without even knowing it. There was a time when none of this felt complicated, when the relationship between Michael and Buddy was so natural it never had to be questioned, back when mornings started the same way every single day with Buddy already awake before the sun, lying just outside the bedroom door, as if he had been waiting there for hours, and the moment Michael opened his eyes and stepped into the hallway, Buddy would lift his head instantly. Tail sweeping across the floor in steady, rhythmic thumps, not explosive, not demanding, just steady and certain, like he already knew that moment belonged to them, and Michael would say his name without thinking, not loud, not sharp, just warm, and Buddy would walk over with that relaxed confidence that only comes from feeling completely safe, completely wanted, and those first few seconds of the day, before the coffee, before the phone, before anything else, were enough to set the tone for everything that followed, because in Buddy's world, those moments were not small, they were everything. They were the confirmation that he mattered, that he was seen, that he was part of something stable and predictable, and it showed in everything he did, in the way he followed Michael from room to room without hesitation, in the way he rested his head on Michael's knee without asking, in the way he made eye contact and held it just long enough to feel that quiet connection that most people never notice but every dog feels deeply. And when they went outside, it was never rushed, never forced. Buddy would stop and sniff every few feet, nose close to the ground, reading the world in a way no human ever could, and Michael would wait, sometimes impatient, but still present, still allowing those moments to happen, and that patience, even when it was not perfect, told Buddy something important. It told him that his needs were allowed to exist, that he was not just being managed, he was being understood, and over time, all of those small, ordinary interactions built something that felt unbreakable, not because it was dramatic or intense, but because it was consistent, predictable, and safe, and that is what trust actually looks like to a dog, not grand gestures, not occasional bursts of affection, but the quiet repetition of moments where nothing goes wrong, where nothing feels uncertain, where everything makes sense, And the reason that matters so much is because once that pattern begins to change, even slightly, even in ways that seem harmless from a human perspective, your dog notices immediately, not as a conscious thought, not as a judgment, but as a shift in the emotional pattern they have come to rely on. And when that pattern breaks often enough, even in the smallest ways, it starts to reshape how they experience you, not all at once, not in a way that is obvious, but in a way that slowly changes the foundation of the bond you thought would always stay the same. At first, nothing felt like a problem because from Michael's point of view, everything he was doing made sense in the moment. It was not intentional, it was not careless in a way he could recognize, it was just life moving faster than the quiet rhythm Buddy had always depended on. Mornings became rushed. The alarm went off later than it should. His first instinct was no longer to look for Buddy but to reach for his phone. Scrolling through emails, checking messages, telling himself he would greet Buddy in just a second, but that second stretched into minutes, and by the time he finally said Buddy's name, it came out distracted, flat, almost automatic, missing the warmth that used to define it, and Buddy still came over, still wagged his tail, but there was a slight hesitation now, a tiny pause before he stepped forward, so small it was easy to miss, and throughout the day, those moments repeated in different forms. When they went outside, the walks became shorter, faster, more about getting it done than experiencing it together. Every time Buddy stopped to sniff something, Michael would give the leash a quick tug and say come on, not harsh enough to seem wrong, just firm enough to move things along, and Buddy would follow. But the curiosity that once guided him began to shrink, replaced by a quieter, more cautious version of himself, and inside the house, the pattern continued. Buddy would rest his head gently on Michael's leg, looking for that familiar connection, but if Michael was busy or focused on something else, he would absent-mindedly push him away or say not now without even looking down. And again, it did not feel like a big moment, it did not feel like something that mattered, but to Buddy, it was another signal, another small piece of information about where he stood. And then there were the times Michael used his name differently, calling Buddy sharply when he was frustrated, repeating it when he did not respond fast enough, letting irritation slip into his tone without realizing it, and over time, Buddy began to associate his own name not just with attention, but with uncertainty. Sometimes it meant something good, sometimes it meant tension, and he started to hesitate, just slightly, just enough to change the way he responded, and the most dangerous part of all of this was how normal it felt. How easy it was to justify every single moment on its own, because none of them were extreme, none of them felt like they could cause damage, but when you put them together, when they repeated day after day, they began to form a new pattern, one where the safety Buddy once felt was no longer guaranteed, one where he had to think just a little more, hesitate just a little longer, and slowly, without any single moment standing out, the bond that once felt effortless started to carry a quiet weight that neither of them fully understood yet. The change did not arrive with a loud moment, or a single mistake that Michael could point to and fix. It showed up in the small spaces between interactions, in the subtle shifts that are easy to ignore until they begin to form a pattern that feels unfamiliar. Buddy still followed him from room to room, but there was more distance now, not the close, almost instinctive presence he once kept, but a few extra feet, as if he was no longer completely sure where he was supposed to be, and when Michael sat down, Buddy would hesitate before approaching, sometimes choosing to lie down across the room instead of resting his head on Michael's leg like he used to. And when he did come closer, the contact was shorter, lighter, less certain. Like he was testing the moment instead of trusting it, and the eye contact changed too, once steady and soft, now brief and cautious, his gaze drifting away sooner, as if holding that connection felt different than it once did, and during walks, Buddy no longer pulled forward with curiosity, no longer stopped with the same confidence to explore every scent along the sidewalk. Instead he stayed closer, moving at Michael's pace without needing correction, which from the outside might look like improvement, like better behavior. But something important had been lost in that quiet compliance, something that used to be expressive and engaged had become reserved and careful, and inside the house, the greetings that once filled the space with energy were now muted. Buddy still came when Michael called, but not with the same immediate response. Not with that full-body excitement that made it clear there was no hesitation in his decision. Now there was a pause, a brief calculation, a moment, where Buddy seemed to ask himself whether coming over would lead to something positive or something uncertain. And these changes were not dramatic enough to alarm most people. They did not look like a problem. They looked like a dog settling down, maturing, becoming calmer with age. And that is exactly why they are so often missed. Because what is actually happening is not a loss of energy, it is a shift in emotional safety. A gradual adjustment in how the dog experiences the person they trust. And the most difficult part is that from Michael's perspective, he was not doing anything wrong, he was not trying to push Buddy away, he still cared, still provided, still believed their bond was intact, but what he could not see was how each small interaction, each slightly rushed response, each moment of distraction or tension, was quietly rewriting the way Buddy felt in his presence, not enough to break the bond, not enough to create distance that could not be crossed, but enough to change the quality of it, enough to make something that once felt effortless now require thought, caution, and adjustment. And by the time those changes become visible, by the time you can actually feel that something is different, it has already been happening for longer than you think. It was not one big moment that made Michael stop and question everything, it was something much quieter, something that would have been easy to brush off if it had only happened once. But this time it lingered. He was sitting on the couch late in the evening, the television playing softly in the background, his phone in his hand, scrolling without really paying attention, and Buddy walked over slowly, not with urgency, not with excitement. Just a calm, deliberate step, and he placed his head gently on Michael's knee, exactly the way he had done 100 times before, a simple gesture that used to mean comfort, connection, presence, and without thinking, without even looking down, Michael shifted slightly and moved Buddy's head away with his hand, not harshly, not with intention, just absent-mindedly, like clearing space without realizing what he was moving, and for a split second, nothing seemed different. Buddy stepped back, stood there quietly, and then instead of trying again, instead of adjusting or nudging like he used to, he simply turned and walked a few steps away, lowering himself onto the floor across the room, and that was it. No sound, no reaction, no attempt to reconnect, just a quiet withdrawal that felt almost invisible, but something about it made Michael pause. His thumb stopped scrolling, his attention finally breaking away from the screen, and he looked over at Buddy, really looked this time. And what he saw was not a dog resting, not a dog relaxing, but a dog who had chosen not to try again, and that was the moment that felt different, because Buddy had always tried again before. If he was pushed away, he would come back a few seconds later. If ignored, he would find another way to connect, a nudge, a look, a small movement to close the gap. But this time, there was no second attempt, no persistence, just acceptance, and that silence carried more weight than any obvious reaction ever could, because it revealed something Michael had not been paying attention to. The pattern had changed. Not just in small behaviors, but in Buddy's willingness to reach out at all, and that realization did not come with clarity at first. It came with a subtle discomfort, a question that lingered in the back of his mind. When did that stop happening? When did Buddy decide that trying again was no longer worth it? And the more Michael thought about it, the more he started to notice other moments that suddenly felt connected, the hesitation at the door, the shorter eye contact, the quieter greetings. All of it forming a pattern that he had missed because each piece on its own felt harmless. And now, sitting there in the quiet room, with Buddy lying just a little farther away than he used to, Michael felt something shift in his own understanding, not a full realization yet, but the beginning of one, the kind that starts with a single uncomfortable thought. What if this is not random? What if this is not just him changing? What if this is the result of something I have been doing all along without ever noticing it? That question did not leave Michael's mind the next morning. It followed him in a way that felt unfamiliar, not loud, not overwhelming, but persistent, like something quietly asking to be understood, and for the first time in a long while, he began to pay attention differently, not just to what Buddy was doing, but to what those actions might actually mean. He noticed how Buddy watched him from across the room before deciding whether to come closer, how there was a slight pause every time he said his name, how the tail still moved but not with the same loose, full-body confidence it once had, and as he observed these moments, something deeper started to connect in his mind, because what he was seeing was not random behavior, it was a pattern, a response, a reflection of something that had been happening over time. And this is the part most people never fully understand. Dogs do not interpret your actions the way you do. They do not separate moments into categories like good day or bad day, busy or stressed. They experience you through consistency, through repeated emotional signals that either build safety or slowly erode it. And when those signals begin to shift, even slightly, their entire perception of the relationship begins to adjust, not out of judgment, not out of resentment, but out of instinct. Because at their core, dogs are constantly asking one question without words: is this space safe? Is this connection predictable? Can I trust what happens next? And every interaction you have with them answers that question in some way, not just the big moments, but especially the small ones, the tone of your voice when you say their name, the way you respond when they seek contact, the patience or impatience in your movements, the attention or distraction in your presence. All of it becomes data. All of it gets stored, and over time, it forms a pattern that your dog relies on to understand you. And here is where it becomes difficult to hear, because what feels insignificant to you can carry meaning for them far beyond what you ever intended. A distracted response does not just mean you are busy, it can feel like rejection. A sharp tone does not just mean you are correcting behavior, it can feel like tension. Inconsistency does not just mean life is unpredictable, it can feel like instability. And when those feelings repeat often enough, your dog does not get angry. They do something much quieter. They adapt. They begin to protect themselves in small ways. They hesitate before approaching. They reduce how often they initiate contact. They become more cautious with their responses, not because they have stopped caring, but because they are adjusting to what they have learned from you. And that is the part that changes everything, because it means the distance you are starting to feel is not coming from nowhere. It is not your dog randomly changing, it is your dog responding in the only way they know how, based on the pattern you have created together. And once Michael began to see it this way, once he understood that Buddy's behavior was not a mystery but a mirror, the weight of that realization settled in, not as guilt in the dramatic sense, but as a quiet awareness that something important had been shifting right in front of him, and he had been too distracted to see it. Once Michael understood that Buddy's behavior was not random but a reflection of repeated experiences, something deeper began to surface, something that most people never fully confront, because it challenges one of the most comforting beliefs about dogs, the idea that no matter what you do, they will always forgive you, always return to you the same way, always love you without any change. And while it is true that dogs are incredibly forgiving in ways humans often are not, that forgiveness does not erase patterns, it does not undo emotional learning, it does not restore something that has been gradually reshaped over time. And this is where the reality becomes uncomfortable, because what Buddy was doing was not holding a grudge, he was not punishing Michael, he was not choosing to distance himself out of anger, he was adapting to what he had learned, and that adaptation is quiet, almost invisible, but incredibly powerful, because it changes how he engages, how he connects, how he decides whether to try again or not. And the more Michael watched, the more he began to notice the exact moments where this shift showed up, not in obvious ways, but in subtle decisions that carried meaning. When Buddy approached and stopped just short of full contact, when he looked up but quickly looked away instead of holding that gaze, when he responded to his name but without that immediate, eager energy that used to define it. And the most striking realization was this: Buddy was still there, still loyal, still present, but something inside the way he experienced Michael had changed, and that change was not temporary, it was the result of repetition, of patterns that had taught him to be just a little more careful, just a little more reserved. And this is the part that most people misunderstand, because they think forgiveness means everything resets. But for a dog, what matters is not whether they forgive, it is what they have learned to expect. And once a certain expectation has been built, once a certain emotional pattern has been repeated enough times, it becomes the new normal, not something they question, not something they analyze, just something they live by. And that means some things do not simply disappear. They become part of how the dog navigates the relationship, moving forward, and when Michael finally saw it clearly, when he connected all of those small moments into one continuous pattern, the realization landed with a quiet weight that was impossible to ignore, because it was not about one mistake, it was about the accumulation of many small ones, and more importantly, it was about understanding that the bond he thought was unbreakable had not been broken. But it had been reshaped in ways he had never intended, and that awareness did not come with panic or urgency. It came with something more difficult, a sense of responsibility, the understanding that if those patterns were learned over time, then they could only be changed the same way, slowly, consistently, through actions that meant something, not occasionally, not when it was convenient, but every single day, in the same small moments that had created the shift in the first place. The next step did not come from a sudden burst of emotion or a dramatic apology. It came from something much quieter, a decision to change the smallest moments first, because that was where everything had started. The next morning Michael woke up and for the first time in a long while, he did not reach for his phone. He sat up slowly and looked toward the doorway where Buddy used to wait, and this time, Buddy was there. But not as close as before, not pressed against the door, just lying a few feet back, watching, and instead of calling his name casually, Michael paused, made eye contact, and said it softly, with intention, and for a second, Buddy did not move. There was that hesitation again, that brief moment of uncertainty, but then he stood up and walked over, not quickly, not with that old automatic excitement, but he came, and Michael did not rush it. He let the moment happen, reaching down and placing his hand gently on Buddy's head, not as a distraction, not as an afterthought, but as the first action of his day. And it was subtle, almost nothing from the outside, but to Buddy, it was a different signal, one that had not been consistent for a long time, and throughout the day. Michael stayed aware in a way he had not been before. When Buddy stopped to sniff during their walk, he did not pull the leash. He waited, even when it felt slow, even when it tested his patience, because he understood now that those moments were not wasted time. They were part of how Buddy experienced the world, and more importantly, part of how Buddy experienced being with him. And inside the house, when Buddy approached, Michael responded, not every single time with long interaction, but with acknowledgement, a glance, a soft word. A brief touch that said, "I see you, I am here," and at first, the changes were almost invisible. Buddy still hesitated, still kept that slight distance, still held back just enough to show that the pattern had not yet shifted, but there were small signs, moments that felt different in a way Michael could now recognize, the tail wagging a little more freely when he spoke in a calm voice, the eye contact lasting a fraction longer than the day before, the way Buddy leaned in just slightly more when resting beside him. And none of it was dramatic, none of it was immediate, because that is not how trust rebuilds. It does not return all at once, it grows the same way it was changed, through repetition, through consistency, through moments that feel safe enough to be trusted again. And the hardest part was not knowing how long it would take, not having a clear sign that everything was fixed, but choosing to continue anyway, because for the first time, Michael understood that this was not about fixing a problem, it was about rebuilding a pattern, one small interaction at a time, until the feeling that once came naturally could begin to exist again, not exactly the same as before, but something real, something earned through awareness, patience, and a willingness to show up differently in the moments that mattered most. Days passed, and while nothing about the change was immediate, something deeper began to settle into place, not just in Buddy's behavior, but in the way Michael experienced every interaction, because once you become aware of the impact of small moments, you cannot unsee them. You begin to notice how a single tone of voice can either open a connection or close it, how a brief glance can either invite closeness or create distance. And over time, those small choices started to shape a new pattern between them, one that felt slower, more intentional, and gradually, almost quietly, Buddy began to respond in ways that felt familiar again, not identical to the past, but close enough to remind Michael of what had once been there. The hesitation at the door became shorter, the tail carried a little more ease in its movement, and one evening, as Michael walked through the front door, there was a moment, just a split second, where Buddy moved faster than usual, not a full run, not the explosive excitement from before, but a step forward without hesitation, and that moment carried more meaning than anything dramatic ever could, because it showed that something inside Buddy was shifting back, not because of one action, not because of one day, but because of consistency. Because the pattern was changing again. And that is the part most people overlook when they think about their relationship with their dog. They believe love is the foundation, and it is, but love alone does not define the experience. It is the repeated signals within that love that shape how it feels on the other side, and dogs live entirely inside that feeling. They do not separate intention from action, they respond to what happens again and again, and when those experiences become predictable in a positive way, trust grows, quietly but powerfully, and when they become inconsistent or uncertain, trust adjusts just as quietly. And the truth that stayed with Michael long after he began to see these changes was not about guilt or regret, it was about understanding something far more important, that the bond between a human and a dog is not something fixed, it is something living, something constantly shaped by the smallest interactions that most people never think twice about. And while dogs may not hold on to mistakes in the way humans do, they do carry forward what they have learned, and that learning becomes the lens through which they see you. And once you understand that, once you truly see how much those small moments matter, you realize that every interaction is an opportunity. Not just to avoid damage, but to build something stronger, something more stable, something that does not rely on assumption but on awareness. And in the quiet of that understanding, as Buddy rested a little closer than he had the week before, there was a simple, lasting truth that did not need to be said out loud, that what you do every day matters far more than what you believe, and your dog has been showing you that all along.